Okay, let's see if I can get this. Hello dark lovelies, it's me, Miss Honey Bunny, your mistress of all things fantasy and fun and TTRPG related, and today I'm going to be walking you through the general steps of how I design a monster for my D&D world, and showing you the design process of one of my most recent creatures. And the first thing we're going to think about is your players. Whenever it comes to your players, you want to keep in mind where the campaign they are is playing and what the setting of that campaign is. So when you're playing something like Call of Cthulhu, when you create a monster for that, you necessarily don't have to keep to the rules of biology, of kind of that scientific reasoning of will it make sense in my world. You can kind of stretch that because, you know, with an eldritch beast or something like that, that's not something when you keep in mind. But something especially for low level players, something that's going to be found naturally in your wild, that's what we're talking about today. So the first thing you really want to, take into account whenever you're creating a creature is ecological niche. This is a big thing when thinking about animals in our natural world. So because their ecological niche is going to really determine what they look like, where they live, what they eat, and how they behave. That is your biggest part. So where your players are and where you want to put this creature. Start with something as easy as, oh, it's a grazing animal, oh, it's a creature that lives under the sea, or something more specific like this is a creature that lives primarily in dungeons controlled by liches. It can really be anything as broad or as specific as you need. Oh, my camera fell. Be afraid to play those broad, very hyper-specific fantasy tropes. Having a monster that consumes magic or absorbs it, or having a creature that lives on the souls of people, that is something that can exist in your world. Then the next thing you want to consider is how the creature evolved, but in very, very simple terms. You don't want to go into the specifics of it started out as this creature and ended up as this creature. You just kind of want to have the idea of how that animal got to where it was, depending on its environment, depending on what it needed to exist. For example, taking into account, Dragonborns evolved from dragons. That can help you get the kind of idea of the chain of how it went through and became what you have now. The next thing you're going to think about after thinking about your campaign and thinking about your players and what really you want to do with this creature that you're creating is what you're basing it on. So a lot of the most successful monsters that you're going to see in media, in movies, in TTRPGs are typically based on an animal, whether that be a giant dinosaur, whether that be a dolphin. That is something you want to take account, because taking into account a already existing creature can help you decide kind of further steps from now about how that creature is going to act and how it is going to react to your players. So for this particular one, I chose the mountain lion because the whole idea when I was coming up with this monster was I wanted to take inspiration from the displacer beast. So the displacer beast, ooh, my camera's getting all movie. The displacer beast, I did really like that creature and I really liked its mechanics, but it necessarily didn't really make sense for where my players were. I wanted to take the displacer beast and reimagine it into my own creature called the Crested Ttrpgs. I'll talk about how I came up with that name later, but for right now, let's get into the design phase. So when it came to redesigning the displacer beast, my players have been in a more of a forested, kind of rainy area, and they were investigating a monster attack, as the chief of law enforcement had called it, on a local family-owned farm. And not only would they be fighting a different monster I had designed called the Bellow Beast, they would also need something that was a little bit more, a little more jumpy, a little bit more kind of agile, to kind of sneak up on them, to give them a different monster that would cause them to rethink their strategy with something completely new, something stealthy, something they couldn't necessarily see right away. And that brought me to the Displacer Beast. A lovely monster, but didn't necessarily fit what I needed at the time. So I started with some design sketches, this is a really bad photo of it, but when I'm designing a creature, after I decide what its role is and where it lives, I tend to immediately go into the design phase. A lot of the times, visualizing what a creature looks like helps me decide more specific elements. Pause, because I really want to go back to those kind of quills on the back of its head, that crest that gives it the name, Crested Ttrpgs. The crest took me a while. so many different concept sketches, design sketches early, very, very early on. Its whole crest was made of basically tons and tons of whiskers that when they vibrated, that's what casted the spell. But as I was going through this it literally took me till the final design to get this. It didn't really look right to have these large, thick whiskers coming out of its face and have that be what casted the spell. And I eventually settled on this more like porcupine quill design. And the idea of like when you shake the quills, they knock together. So what happened? And since most spells, what are they? Verbal, right? So that's where the idea came from. So unlike people, you know, they have to speak the words, the crested ther just uses its quill like kind of those quill like appendages on its crest, and as they shake together actually cast the spell prestidigitation. I gave it its markings to kind of lean into the whole displacing its location. I gave it a lot of natural browns, a lot of beiges for its coloring, and for its crest it reminded me a lot of elephant's ears, so I kind of went with a little bit more of a gray. Whenever thinking about designs, some general tips to keep in mind are things like symmetry. Putting that into any design creature, even if super fantastical and not really scientific at all, can help it seem more like it makes sense. Unless, you know, you're trying to go for like, I don't know, a weird bird that has three wings on one side of its body. Don't be afraid to move any type of orifice around. We can see a lot of creatures in movies like Avatar have breathing holes on the sides of their neck. And even though that is a really weird place to put that does make sense in our world. There are creatures who breathe through their butts, as per se. So don't be afraid to kind of switch it up a little. Animal classes and reproduction are really, really important, and they don't necessarily have to go together. You can have things like warm-blooded lizards or mammals that lay eggs, because things like bird and lizard, those classes may not necessarily exist in your world. For things like humanoids, think about their reproduction in a sense. So humanoids that lay eggs may not necessarily need things like breasts. And really, when it comes to biology, if you necessarily don't need an explanation, and this can always be something that you think of later, you don't necessarily need internal organs. And while that may be important for explaining how your dragon can breathe fire, that may not be an everyday thing that may come up in your world. Unless you have like a super interesting idea for it, then go ahead, 100%. I want to see how a unicorn shoots magic from its horn. See a lot in the show Avatar. I've been talking a lot about the movie, I can talk about the show. Having animals that are just A animal combined with B animal do work extremely well. Think about the turtle duck from Avatar, right? That still makes sense in that world, even though it's just A animal combined with B animal. Still makes a lot of sense. Think about a hawk coming down, talons outstretched to grab this duck, but it hits the shell and it breaks the talons. That leaves that hawk vulnerable, so it's less likely to go after the tiny turtle duck, allowing for better species reproduction and reintroduction and better turtle duck repopulation. With that, it brings us to the big honcho of the night, and probably what everyone clicked on this for: stat. I don't have one for this one. Whenever it comes to creating a stat block for a creature, I suggest that you take in a pre-existing stat block and kind of tweak it to what you're wanting to do. So if you're wanting to create a giant Godzilla-like kaiju, you may want to start with something like the Ttrpgs or a Kraken, depending on if it's going to be a water battle or if it's going to be a mostly on land battle. And you can adjust it to add things like an atomic breath weapon or a fire weapon, or you can even adjust the challenge rating if you want to make a creature a little bit easier. Like I've taken before Mindful players and have made them to be able to fight level 2 party members. And once you find that stat block that is similar enough to what you are wanting to create, you can then go through and adjust those stat blocks. So going back to the Crested Ttrpgs, originally it did start as just the Displacer beast, but not only did I need it to be a little bit more stealthier, so I upped its stealth stat, I also wanted its attacks to be slightly different. So I gave it the spell casting ability of casting the word. And the next thing is going to be calculating the challenge rating of your creature. Whenever it really comes to calculating the challenge rating of your creature, there's a wonderful thing called math. There's a wonderful table in the Dungeon Master's Guide that helps list off our 2 main things we are going to use to kind of average and create that challenge rating for the creature: the offensive and the defensive challenge rating. And as you can see, defense is based on armor class, while offense is based on attack bonus. Going to use this chart to calculate our challenge rating that is going to go into our stat block. Here's a little note. There's also a table in the Dungeon Master's Guide that lists different features a creature can have and how that affects the challenge rating. And now, while you could bust out the calculator, try calculating all those different stats and it just leads to recalculation over recalculation, just use an online challenge rating calculator, and that's just going to save you so much additional time. And that is going to bring us to the end of the design of the Crested Ttrpgs. Well, I hope you all had fun here listening to me ramble for a little bit. You can find this little guy and his template on my Instagram for free to use whenever you'd like. If you have an interesting creature you create using this method, please let me know. I would love to see all the sorts of different creatures people have created. And hey, if you like it, you want to see more, you want to stick around, follow me on my Twitter, on my Instagram, or stay here and chat.